All right, so in the last series, we talked about the brainstem. We focused mainly on the brainstem, starting with the medulla oblongata, then moving into the pons, and then the midbrain. Now we can start to talk about the diencephalon, which is between the brainstem and the cerebrum. And the diencephalon, as we've said, is composed of the thalamus, the main relay from the periphery that brings sensory information from the periphery into these collection of nuclei that are in the thalamus. And those nuclei filter out that information and route the important stuff to the cerebrum. And if that information makes it to the cerebrum, then it can be consciously acknowledged or consciously recognized. So the diencephalon, the main component, or the largest part of it, I should say, is the thalamus. Right under the thalamus, as we've seen, is the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland via the infundibulum. And then we also have the epithalamus, which is the roof of the diencephalon, and it is basically the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is in the posterior part of the epithalamus, and this is secreting a hormone called melatonin, which is important for regulating circadian rhythms and certain sexual functions. All right, so the thalamus is probably one of the main things that we talk about when we think of the diencephalon. And basically, this is filtering any ascending information that is coming from the periphery for the primary sensory cortex, and also is going to relay information from other senses. For example, the retina, which is the sensory part of the eye, back to the occipital cortex where the visual areas are in the brain. We're also going to see that it relays information between these basal nuclei that we talked about earlier and the cerebral cortex as well. So there's several areas of thalamus that are specialized to do certain things. And they have nuclei, just like you have nuclei throughout the brainstem, and also you have what we call subcortical nuclei within the cerebrum as well. All right, so the thalamus, as you recall, is a structure in two parts, a left and right thalamus, and between the left and right thalamus is the third ventricle. And the left and right thalamus have a section of gray matter between them called the interthalamic adhesion. And this basically is just extending from one side to the other through the ventricle. So then we have the thalamic nuclei, and these are very specialized areas of gray matter that relay sensory information to different things. For example, in the cerebral cortex and the basal nuclei. So we got lots of thalamic nuclei, but we got five main groups. We've got the anterior thalamic nuclei. These we will see are associated largely with another system that we'll study a little bit later called the limbic system. And the limbic system is very important for reacting to and interpreting emotions, and basically the emotional control center of the brain. We also have the medial group, which also provides an awareness of emotional states, and it's very near the limbic system. Then we have the ventral group, which is going to be relaying sensory information, especially from example, the periphery. For example, pain, touch, temperature, pressure, these kinds of physical touch sensations. And then we're also going to have the posterior group. And the posterior group is dominated by a very large nucleus called the pulvinar, which is a sensory nucleus as well. Then we have the lateral geniculate nucleus, which, as we said, is going to be relaying information from the retina, which is the sensory portion of the eye, via the optic nerve, which brings that information back. And remember, the optic nerves come together at the optic chiasm. They're going to cross there. And then you're going to have the optic tract, which is going to go to the lateral geniculate nucleus, which will then filter out and process that information, filter out what's irrelevant, sort of put together what is relevant, and send that information to the visual cortex via the optic radiations. Then we're going to have the medial geniculate nucleus, which is going to be a relay station for auditory signals, which are going to be coming from their point of origin will be the ears, and then their eventual destination will be that auditory cortex within the temporal lobes. We also have some lateral group of nuclei that are going to affect some emotional states and help integrate some sensory information. So here we have some pictures of, here's our anterior group, our medial group, lateral group, we've got the ventral group, and here you can see different parts of this ventral group will project to different places. Like this part here will project to those basal nuclei, which are important for regulating and modifying ongoing motor movements. This will be projecting to the cerebellum, which will be basically, the cerebellum has circuits with the basal nuclei. And then we're going to have some general sensory input from the body, from the periphery. This is our pain, touch, temperature, and so forth. And then we're going to have our visual input into the lateral geniculate nucleus and our auditory input into the medial geniculate nucleus. So overall, I would just remember the overall functions of these things and where and what they do, what groups they're associated with, i.e. the anterior group is associated with the limbic system. We'll find that the limbic system is very important with, we'll see later, the frontal lobes and the prefrontal cortex here of the cerebrum, which is important for decision making. And a lot of times your emotions govern your decision making, so it's no coincidence then or surprise that you have circuits related to decision making through these pathways. The posterior group, I would especially know the lateral geniculate nucleus and the medial geniculate nucleus. All right, so then we can look at the hypothalamus. In the hypothalamus, we have these two bodies right behind it, which are considered part of the hypothalamus, called the mammillary bodies, so called because they look like nipples, or at least to somebody they did who named them. And these are going to be processing olfactory information and also control reflexive eating movements. We have the infundibulum, which is the stalk or funnel that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, and then we have the tubral area. Basically it's what's between the infundibulum and the mammillary bodies, and this is also has some control over the pituitary gland. All right, so here's sort of a map of all this stuff. You see all these different nuclei in the hypothalamus. We're not going to get into these a lot at all. Later on, when we study hormones, we will study the paraventricular nucleus. We will also study several of these other ones. So we will probably be studying the suprachiasmatic nucleus a little bit later in this chapter. And we will also be studying the supraoptic nucleus when we get to the chapter on hormones and the endocrine system. All right. So here's your infundibulum. Here's your tubral region right here. And here's your mammillary body right here, one of them. And they're paired as well. All right. So then we've got some functions that we need to know of the hypothalamus. So we've got several functions other than hormonal control and emotional control. We've got subconscious control of skeletal muscles, autonomic function. Well, a lot of that is through the endocrine system. We also have coordination of nervous and endocrine systems. There again, that kind of falls. These are sort of grouped together. We secrete certain hormones. We've already talked about antidiuretic hormone that's secreted by the supraoptic nucleus. That is going to regulate water loss at kidneys in the distal convoluted tubules and the collecting duct, which we'll learn about a lot more in later chapters, not even in this section. And then oxytocin, which is secreted by the paraventricular nucleus. All right, let's see. We also have producing emotions and behavioral drives, so feeding center, thirst center, hunger. That's true. If you damage the hypothalamus, you can cause a dysregulation in feeding, either overfeeding or underfeeding. And you can also have a situation if there's a tumor or a problem in the hypothalamus where someone would be drinking far more than they need or just constantly be thirsty. And it also, one of the major functions of it, as you probably remember when we go back to our first chapter and talking about the homeostasis, where you have your receptor, your control center, and your effectors. And we talked about body temperature regulation. Well, the body temperature control center for that is in the hypothalamus. And it also has some involvement in circadian rhythms as well, regulating circadian rhythms through the suprachiasmatic nucleus. All right. So then, if we move above the diencephalon, then we can actually move into the cerebrum. And we're now talking about the limbic system. The limbic system is basically a collection of things within the cerebrum and some nuclei and some other things that's going to be very important for emotional states. It's also going to be important for learning and memory, for consolidating short-term memory into long-term memory. As we'll learn, it's even involved in spatial navigation. And it also will link conscious functions of the cerebral cortex with the autonomic functions of the brainstem. So the limbic system has several components to it. We have, well, the first they mentioned is the amygdaloid body, which interestingly is it's a nucleus, and it's basically going to be very important in threat assessment. And it's going to be important for figuring out if something is scary, if it needs to be reacted to, if it's pain, or if it's something that needs to be avoided. So the amygdaloid body is important in threat assessment. And it also is important in various interface between the limbic system and the cerebrum. We will see that the amygdaloid body, the amygdala as it's sometimes called, can be affected in people who've had, say, post-traumatic stress disorder and these kinds of things. And it's important in certain decision-making tasks as well. So then we can look at the cerebral hemispheres. Each cerebral hemisphere has a limbic lobe, which is basically a collection of gyri. We've got the cingulate gyrus, which is right over the corpus callosum. It follows it. The dentate gyrus, which is right on the interior part of the temporal lobe, and the parahippocampal gyrus, which surrounds a structure called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is extremely important in learning and memory, in spatial navigation, and also in consolidating short-term memories to long-term memories. It's also, unfortunately, the site of a lot of epileptic foci. So a lot of times in the past, when there's been damage to the hippocampus, it can cause epileptic seizures, and sometimes part of the hippocampus has to be removed. And in people who have had bilateral removal of the hippocampus, they were unable to consolidate any new long-term memories from their experiences. So they could meet someone, interact with that person, and as soon as that person left the room, they'd forget all about that person, never remembered again, and the person could come back into the room 5 minutes later, and they wouldn't recognize him. All right, so there's another interesting area of the limbic system. One's called the fornix, and this is the white matter tract that's bringing information from the hippocampus to the hypothalamus and is a information exchange pathway for these two sections of the brain, and specifically with the mammillary bodies. So you also have the anterior nuclei of the thalamus on each side. These are also important. These will be relaying information from the mammillary body to the cingulate gyrus. And also, the limbic system has connections with the reticular formation. So this is what we say when we're talking about autonomic functions, but also emotional functions, because emotions will affect your states of arousal. So if you're angered, that will certainly wake you up. If you're afraid, if you feel pain, or if there's sexual arousal or pleasure. So here's sort of a map of the limbic system. Here we have the cingulate gyrus, and it sort of encircles the corpus callosum or follows it. And then if you follow it, or just keep on going around into the temporal lobe, you have the parahippocampal gyrus here, and then you have the dentate gyrus, and within it is the hippocampus. So the dentate gyrus is kind of embedded within the parahippocampal gyrus. You also have the amygdala, which isn't shown in this section, but the amygdaloid body is right here. And it would be just anterior to and superior to the tip of the hippocampus. All right. Let's see. All right. So then you can look at the rest of the cerebrum, and this is basically controlling all the conscious thoughts and intellectual functions. So you've got somatic, sensory, and motor information that's being processed here and given from here or issued from here. So as we see, the cerebrum, part of the limbic system is in the cerebrum. So you can consider part of the limbic system in the cerebrum and the other part of the limbic system being in some of these other structures like the thalamus. So it's really sort of straddling the two. And limbic means on the border of. So that's an interesting name for it. And we find part of it in the diencephalon and part of it in the cerebrum. But the rest of the cerebrum is basically controlling all your thoughts and intellectual functions. This is where you're going to receive all your somatic sensory information. It's where you're going to be receiving your visual and auditory special sensory information and processing it, deciding what to do with it in all of these association areas, which will put together the information that is being received from the sense organs like the eyes and the ears and the nose and the tongue, or I should say that a lot of gustation is sensed in the tongue or taste. And it's going to be putting that information together into a cohesive picture. So association areas in cortex are going to be doing that. And then some other areas will be planning what actions to take and motor movements. And ultimately, you're going to have some kind of motor commands issued to skeletal muscles. And that will be from the primary motor cortex. So as we've said, the cerebrum is largely two things: gray matter, which is in these cerebral cortex, which is that 1 to 5 millimeter thick covering, the outside of the brain of the cerebrum that we talked about before, that's gray matter. And then we have the basal nuclei, which we already mentioned, which are important for monitoring and modifying ongoing motor movement. Then we have white matter, and these are those myelinated axon bundles. These are tracts that are carrying information from one part of the brain to another, or from one part of the brain down to the spinal cord. And so the white matter is going to be deep to the cortex, and this is supposed to be cerebral cortex, and it's going to flow around and through the basal nuclei through something called the internal capsule. We'll see that in just a little bit. But as we've said, we've already shown that in the cerebrum we have these gyri, and these are basically these convexities. And this is basically to fold the cerebral cortex so that you can fit it into a smaller space. Because as human intellect became greater and greater, the space of cortex, the amount of cortex needed, became larger and larger. But you couldn't just keep expanding the brain and the cranial vault to accommodate this, because then our heads would be huge and we'd look like the aliens that they have in all the alien movies. So instead, what happened was the cortex started folding in on itself. And if you look at other primates, they have some gyri and sulci, but not as many. And if you keep looking in other animals like rats, they have almost none. And if you look at certain other animals, cats have some. But the larger the brains, the larger the intellectual capacity of the animal, the more infolding of this cortex to increase the surface area to create these gyri and sulci. And so basically what you've got is an increase of surface area without increasing the volume. We even have within, there was one thing that we were not able to show in this previous picture, or even in our overall picture of the brain, is a part of cortex that is sort of buried, where you have to retract the temporal lobe and look inside, called the insula, which means the island. And it's inside the brain, inside the other cortical regions, and you'd actually have to retract back the temporal lobe to see it. And so it's actually inside. If you look at that landmark that separates the temporal lobe from the parietal lobe, that is that lateral sulcus, you would be able to see it inside. And then we would see we've already talked about what the longitudinal fissure is. This is this large fissure that separates the cerebral hemispheres. However, the corpus callosum does cross it. So the longitudinal fissure does not separate the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the white matter tract that communicates between the two hemispheres. And then we've got these lobes. And we've sort of gone over some of them in lab, and we've talked a little bit about what goes on in each lobe. But we basically have all of these different infoldings with surface area that's increased by infolding, and you've got this cortical surface that is now following these gyri and sulci, and the sulci are these grooves in between, and the fissures are the larger grooves. So here's our lateral sulcus that separates this temporal lobe, which we've probably seen already in lab if you've done the lab, temporal lobe from the overlying lobes. Here we've got the central sulcus, which is going to separate the parietal lobe here, from the frontal lobe, which is all that which is in front of it. And then we have our occipital lobe here, which is dedicated to vision. So all of this is occipital lobe. We've got our cerebellum, and you can see a little bit of the pons in there and the medulla. But so that gets us back to some of our landmarks. We've already seen our central sulcus, a very important landmark that's going to delineate really the anterior part and posterior part of the brain. So the anterior part, everything in front of the central sulcus, is going to be the frontal lobe. From here on back to about here, we have the parietal lobes. From here on down, we have the occipital lobe. From here to approximately here, we have the temporal lobe, and we have a lot of areas that sort of we'll find as we study. We have some areas that are specific. For example, the occipital pole back here is going to be our primary visual processing area that's receiving the raw visual information straight from the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. And then we're going to have all kinds of visual association areas. They're going to put together this information. So it's going to tell you not just light that hits the brain or the retina in a certain way of the eye and where it hit, but it's going to be assembled into patterns that mean something, like what something is, where it is, what color it is, what shape it is. And you're going to have increasingly higher processing in these visual association areas. And then we can go over to the temporal lobe here, and we'll find, not surprisingly, that we're going to have our primary auditory cortex, and it'll actually follow this sulcus over sort of inside this lobe here, but you're going to have the primary auditory cortex right here on both sides, and then you're going to have some auditory association areas that are going to interpret what you're hearing and make it into meaningful, turn it into something that's meaningful, not just a sound, but what the sound means, what maybe, characteristics of that sound, maybe tone and timbre and all these things. So now we're also going to have some olfactory cortex that's also in the temporal lobe. And we're going to see as well that we will have association areas around some of the junctions of these areas. So some other interesting processing areas, for example, right in front of the central sulcus in the frontal lobe, we have this precentral gyrus. Not surprisingly called that. It follows it's anterior to the central sulcus, and this is going to be our primary motor cortex. And this is where all your motor commands are going to come from. So you have large neurons here called pyramidal neurons that will project down to centers in the spinal cord. And these are going to be the neurons that are going to control the output of your skeletal muscles. Right behind the central sulcus, we have the postcentral gyrus, which is in the parietal cortex. This is your primary somatosensory cortex. So this is where you're going to be receiving information about stimuli, physical touch, pain, temperature stimuli around your body, like what's on your skin and this kind of thing. So what's interesting about both of these is that they map to a very specific part of the body. And we will see that there are maps so that if you stimulate a certain area, for example, of motor cortex, you would get the arm to move. If you stimulated another area of motor cortex, you'd get the foot to move if you could go in deep. And the same thing with the somatosensory cortex, the primary somatosensory cortex. If you stimulated a particular part of the somatosensory cortex in a particular place. That place would be specific to a location on the body. So you could make someone feel something on their arm by stimulating that representation, that part of the somatosensory cortex. Behind the somatosensory cortex, we have sensory association areas, which is a lot of the parietal lobe. We have a lot of sensory integration going on between auditory and vision in these areas here. And so what we'll find is we have a lot of integration of different types of information in some of these association areas. If we look at the frontal lobe, we have areas up here, prefrontal cortex, that's important in decision making, planning, assessing consequences, long-term consequences of actions, and these kinds of things. And there are extensive connections with the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, not surprisingly. All right, we also have what's called a supplementary motor area, which is in front of the central gyrus, the precentral gyrus, and it's going to be important for planning motor movements. Up here, we're going to have something called the frontal eye field, and it's going to be on both hemispheres, and it's going to be important for planning eye movements, especially eye movements called saccades, which are subconscious movements even that help you track things in space. So if you're watching a car drive by, your eyes may track it. When you're tracking words on the page that you're reading and your eyes are skimming over the rows of words, this is important. The frontal eye fields are important in planning those movements. So you've got different areas of the brain that are specialized to do different things. And while we have these major areas and these major landmarks, these are generalities. So the central sulcus may not look exactly the same in everyone. Though you can identify it in people, it's not exactly the same. The sulci and gyri won't be exactly the same, though the major landmarks are pretty recognizable from one individual to the other. And these areas, where exactly they're located will also vary from one individual to another. For example, we have an area that borders the temporal lobe and some of these parietal association areas called Wernicke's area. And this is lateralized to the left side. So this is important for speech recognition and recognition of spoken word, and also contributes to recognition of the written word. And yet this area is approximately here. It will vary from one individual to another. And so if anyone's going to do surgery on the brain, oftentimes what doctors and scientists will do is they will record from these areas, and with electrodes, using electrodes or surface electrodes or deep electrodes, they'll record neural activities of these areas while the patient is doing a task, so that the researchers and the doctors can localize what functions are there. So we have another important area on the left-hand side that is in the premotor area or the motor association area, and it also borders the temporal lobe, and it's called the motor speech area or Broca's area. And this is important for planning speech movements. So this is important for being able to say the correct words, to be able to coordinate breathing and the timing of breathing and the movements of the muscles of the mouth and the larynx, and to make meaningful speech. And this is Broca's area. And in most people, the majority of people, these are lateralized to the left. So language is lateralized to the left. Often logic and mathematical calculations are lateralized. That is, the left hemisphere is predominantly involved in doing those things. And then the right hemisphere, we have a recognition of spatial relationships. We have recognition of emotional states, and we have some of the more creative aspects. Some of the rhythm aspects are lateralized to the right side of the brain. So while the hemispheres are pretty similar, they still have some individual specializations. So if someone were to damage Wernicke's area on the left-hand side, you would see inability to recognize certain speech, whereas on the right-hand side, in most individuals, you would not have deficits in recognizing the spoken word or recognizing the meaning of words. And likewise, if you had damage to the Broca's area on the left-hand side, you would not be able to make intelligible speech. So you would be able to say stuff, but they might not mean anything. You might be able to say words, but they might not have any meaning or be in any particular order, or you might just be able to make sounds and not really make real meaningful words. So again, these areas are quite different in different people. And the majority of people, I think 91% of people are right-handed, and their language lateralization is on the left. So Wernicke's area is on the left, and Broca's motor speech area is on the left. In a very small percentage of left-handers, these areas are on the right. And that's a small percentage of people, a very small percentage of people. But in some people, the language specialization is on the right. And there's one other exception, is people who have pathology early on, these areas can shift to the right. So people who've had long-term epilepsy and have had seizures maybe around these areas, then some of that function can be taken over on the right side of the brain. All right, so here's just sort of an overview of our lobes once again. Our temporal lobe, and here's our lateral sulcus. Our occipital lobe back here, and that's the posterior part of the brain. Our parietal lobe, everything from the occipital lobe to the central sulcus. And this postcentral gyrus right behind the central sulcus is our primary somatosensory area. So this is where you're going to be able to feel where stuff is touching you on your body, or where somebody's sticking you with a needle, or where that mosquito landed. Over here, we have the primary motor cortex in our precentral gyrus. So very specific motor commands will be issued to skeletal muscles along here. So certain areas are dedicated to the control of certain skeletal muscles. And we'll look at sort of a map of that a little bit later on. And if you were to use something like transcranial magnetic stimulation and stimulate someone right here, you might get an arm movement. So these are the kinds of things that researchers have done. They have stimulated these areas or looked at loss of function in people who've had strokes in these areas. And that's one way early researchers were able to discern what these areas of the brain did. So here's our frontal lobe. This is important for planning a lot of things. A lot of this stuff here is motor planning, and this is going to help plan what motor programs we want to execute. So the final execution pathway for skeletal muscle control will be from here, but all the plans of what we want to do, say we want to play some, I don't know, just some piece on the piano or something, we may plan all of that here and establish the patterns for doing so here. And then when we initiate those patterns, then that will control the muscles that we need in order to execute that motor output. In front of that, again, we have a lot of things that are used for long-term decision-making and planning, especially in the prefrontal cortex here. A lot of connections with prefrontal cortex and limbic system, which is deep to the temporal lobe here. And as you saw, some of the perihippocampal gyrus and dentate gyrus are deep within that temporal area. And then, of course, we have the insula, which if you retract the temporal lobe, and you would see the insula inside, which we talked about a little bit earlier. All right, so now if we look in the mid-sagittal view, we can see the corpus callosum, which is the white matter tract that communicates between the two hemispheres. This is part of the fornix here, and we can't see the whole thing because it curves around here and will eventually curve around here and contact the mammillary bodies and some inputs here. So here we've got our cingulate gyrus right here. Cingulus is like a belt. We can see part of our parietal lobe in the mid-sagittal view. And here we can see our occipital lobe. And we can see another sulcus that's quite clear on the mid-sagittal view, the parieto-occipital sulcus. But if you try to identify it on the exterior view, it's really much harder to see. And it's a discontinuous bunch of sulci that you really can't identify too easily on the exterior of the brain, simply because it varies from one individual to another. And what this parieto-occipital sulcus looks like, while yes, you could say there's a parieto-occipital sulcus, it's not a single sulcus. It's basically a connect the dots from one sulcus to the other. And so people usually don't try to identify it on the exterior part of the brain, but in the mid-sagittal view, it's quite easy to see it. All right, so here we have our frontal lobe again. Here's our precentral gyrus. Here's our postcentral gyrus. Remember, this is motor cortex, primary motor cortex, and this is somatosensory cortex. And these are sensory association areas in the parietal lobe. These are motor planning areas, supplemental motor areas in the frontal lobe. And here we have our prefrontal cortex, which is going to be important for decision making, long-term decision making and planning. All right. So I think we'll stop here and we'll pick up next time and hopefully finish the chapter in the upcoming 2 or 3 lectures.